Hello, and welcome to Virtual Investor Conferences. My name is John Viglotti, and on behalf of OTC Markets, we're very pleased you joined us for our Life Sciences Conference. Our first presentation comes from VolitionRX. And before I introduce our speaker, a few points to note. Please submit your questions in the question box to the left of the slides. And if you're interested in scheduling a meeting with VolitionRX, please click on the Meetings tab found on the left navigation bar. You'll be able to view the company's availability and submit a meeting request. On a final note, all of today's presentations will be recorded and available for 24/7 replay. At this point, I'm very pleased to welcome Scott Powell. He's Head of Investor Relations and the U.S. Chief Financial Officer of VolitionRX, which trades on the NYSE American under the symbol VNRX. Welcome back, Scott.
Thank you, John. Thanks to virtualinvestorconferences.com and the OTC markets. It's great to be back again presenting the VolitionRX story. So again, thank you for having us back again. As mentioned, we're VolitionRX, ticker VNRX on the NYSE American Stock Exchange. Just want to point you to our forward-looking statements and disclaimer slide. Just a reminder that I will be making some forward-looking statements on today's presentation, and some of those may or may not materialize in the future. So I do point you to the forward-looking statements and disclaimer slide here. A little bit about Volition. We are a diagnostics company. We're working predominantly in blood, developing blood tests to screen for different disease states, oncology and non-oncology based disease states in both humans and in animals. You can see we have a significant intellectual property portfolio. As you can see here, 15 patents already granted in Europe, 12 in the United States, 122 patents pending. And these are some very important patents that are fairly broad in terms of the grant or the real estate, if you will. And we think this provides us with a very defensible position. And we believe that a number of these patents could unlock future significant value for Volition and our shareholders down the road. The platform, as I mentioned, is both focused on human diagnostics as well as animal diagnostics. It's all powered by the Nu-Q platform, and that stands for nucleosome quantification. And some investors, often ask, how does the company do so much, and how are we developing so many different products for so many different disease states? And it's because these are all off of the same diagnostics platform, the same technological platform. Won't go too much into the science, but we do have 5 verticals within the company, and I'll focus predominantly on the first 2, Nu-Q Vet and Nu-Q Nets. Nu-Q Vet is, not surprisingly, our animal health division, and we are now commercial stage here with a cancer screening test to screen for various cancers in canines. And Nu-Q Nets, that's our NETosis program in humans, and that is to perform a risk stratification analysis on patients that have been infected with various diseases, and to monitor their disease progression and ideally provide an early warning sign that a patient is about to get really sick from a particular disease state. So I'll focus primarily on those 2 verticals. Those are where many of our milestones will be coming, inflection points, and and value drivers, I think, for the company going forward, are principally in those areas. So I will jump to Nu-Q Vet first. As I just mentioned, these are our key focus areas, these 2, for the coming quarters and years. Not to say that we won't have other news flow and developments in the other verticals, but these are the key focus areas for the company. So I will just go to Nu-Q Vet first, and then I'll come back to Nets. So this is our first commercial product, and it's called the Nu-Q Vet Cancer Screening Test. Now you can see some interesting statistics here. There are about 84 million canines in the United States alone. Every year, about 6 million of those canines are diagnosed with cancer. The problem is almost all of those 6 million diagnoses currently occur because the animal is first sick. So it's demonstrably ill. It might be an older dog that's been demonstrating various symptoms, and you take it to the veterinarian, they run some diagnostic tests, and unfortunately, oftentimes the symptoms are from cancer. And you really don't have good options when you have an older canine diagnosed with cancer because it's symptomatic. That generally means that your dog has a late stage cancer. And there are really only three options you have. You can do nothing, you can treat, and treatment for cancer in canines can be very, very expensive. It can be $25,000, even $50,000 or more to treat a canine with late-stage cancer. So it's a very significant expense. And your third option is euthanasia, right? To euthanize your canine and put it to sleep. None of those are particularly good options, but those are really the only options you have when you have a canine with late-stage cancer. Canines currently, really until the implementation of our blood test this year, canines did not get screened asymptomatically for cancer. They simply don't. And our product aims to change that. And why don't canines get screened asymptomatically for cancer? It's cost, risk, essentially, because the confirmatory diagnostic tests are generally two modalities. So either imaging technologies, so you'd run a sonogram, a X-ray, CAT scan, MRI, and so forth on the animal's particular region of the animal where cancer might be suspected, and or you would run a biopsy, so a tissue sample of the potential infected area. Now, those are both expensive procedures, whether it's an imaging technology that's run or whether it's a biopsy. You're looking at hundreds, thousands of dollars generally to run those tests. Also, because the animal has to be anesthetized, it doesn't know that it's supposed to sit still. So for most imaging technologies and for basically all biopsy procedures, the animal has to be given anesthesia. So there's obviously a cost to that. Anesthesia is also very risky for certain older canines. Some of them don't wake up from the administration of anesthesia, some die. So it's, for these reasons, you don't take a healthy 5-year-old German Shepherd, for instance, into the vet for a wellness check and say, doctor, I'd like to spend a few $1,000s extra so that you can run a full body CAT scan or an MRI of its brain, or do tissue samples of its liver, spleen, pancreas, and stomach to see if my healthy German Shepherd has cancer. You simply don't do that. It's too expensive, it's too invasive, it's too risky. So up until the implementation of our blood test, canines did not get screened asymptomatically for cancer. So just like in human health, if you're not getting screened for certain cancer types, generally, if you have a particular cancer type, it's going unnoticed, undiagnosed until you're symptomatic, right? Until you're sick from that particular cancer or other disease state. And the same thing in humans. If you're symptomatic and tests are run and it turns out the symptoms are coming from a particular cancer type, it's invariably late stage and you have very limited options for the most part. So we're really excited for the implementation of this blood test. It's now been launched by several of our partners. And as you can see here, some of the interesting statistics. As I mentioned, 6 million canines diagnosed with cancer annually, almost all on the symptomatic side. You'll see the top left, 25 to 40% of all humans and all dogs develop cancer. Nearly 50% of all canines over age 10 will develop cancer. So it's a very common affliction, unfortunately. Up until the implementation of our blood test, there was no asymptomatic screening done for cancer in canines. You can see the market is significant, with 84 million canines in the US. There are around 25 million or so of those canines that will be eligible for asymptomatic screening through Volition's blood test, and that is determined based upon age. So in general, canines turning age 7 and older are much more at risk for developing cancer. Certain breeds develop cancer under age 7, like golden retrievers and other breeds, and so screening for certain breeds of canine would start at age 4 or age 5 or age 6. So when you aggregate all the canines that are age 7 and older, and then the breeds that are predisposed to getting cancer under age 7, you're at about 25 million canines annually that will be eligible based upon age and breed for our blood test. What the amount of volition varies from the mid-single digits to the low double digits in terms of what volition gets. So you can do the math. We've partnered with 6 partners to sell our blood test, and if the partners sell 1 million tests, we're looking at maybe 7 to 10 million in revenue for Volition. If they sell 5 million tests, you're looking at perhaps 35 to 40 million in revenue for Volition out of the 25 million canines that are eligible for asymptomatic screening. Now, those canines that are eligible for asymptomatic screening, they generally go to the vet, most of them anyway, go to the vet once per year for wellness checks. It's actually recommended that canines go twice per year for wellness checks, just given their shorter lifespan vis-a-vis humans. Things happen faster, obviously. Canines start to develop cancer at age 10 and 12 and 14 and so forth, where humans generally aren't developing cancer till 60s, 70s, 80s. Obviously, there are exceptions to both of those rules. And obviously, the benefit here is if you take your canine in for a wellness check and it's given a Volition blood test and it's positive, actually we stratify. We have results that are interpreted as low risk, moderate risk, or high risk for cancer. So if your canine's blood test comes back as high risk for cancer, at that point, then you and the vet would likely decide to run those more invasive confirmatory diagnostic tests, such as a CAT scan or MRI or a biopsy procedure, because the canine most likely does have cancer. However, the fact that it's still asymptomatic means that the cancer is probably localized and early stage. Hence, the outcomes and the options are much more plentiful for your canine. So that's why we're so excited about this opportunity, and that's why we've signed licensing deals with some of the major players in the animal health diagnostics space in the United States and globally. You can see a little bit more of the statistics here. These were results for various cancer types for our clinical study that was run at Texas A&M University at their Veterinary College of Medicine. So you can see for a number of common cancers, we're picking up about 3/4 or more of those at 97% specificity. So subtract that from 100 gives you your false positive rate. Only 3% false positives. So essentially negligible or almost nil false positives, which is important because you don't want to be spending all that extra money on imaging technologies and biopsies if your canine does not actually have cancer. So really encouraging and very strong clinical results in the study. It was 662 canines. Most of them did have cancer, and you can see the results there. Again, a great partner with Texas A&M University, where we jointly developed this blood test for canines. As I mentioned, we now have 6 licensing partners. You can see on the left, our blood test has been launched with partners IDEXX, Heska, Texas A&M University's Gastroenterology Lab, Sage Healthcare in Singapore, SCIL Lab, and DNA Tech. The licensing deals with Heska and IDEXX are quite meaningful. The Heska licensing deal was a $28 million licensing deal. We received the first $10 million 1 year ago, March of last year, upon signing of the agreement. And we received the additional $18 million in milestone payments once certain milestones are met. We're expecting 13 million of that 18 before the end of Q2 of this year. So within the next few months, We expect 13 million of the 18 million to come in, and that's non-dilutive capital to Volition. So really excited for the opportunity to bring in some additional non-dilutive financing through the licensing deal. And then in addition, we get a piece of revenue for every test that Heska sells going forward under the licensing agreement. We're getting up to $10 per test for every test they process through their reference labs, and we're getting less than that. We haven't disclosed the actual number for tests they process through their point of care. So there are two ways to process a canine's blood sample. One is the traditional way, where a blood sample is taken from the canine, plasma and serum are separated through a centrifugation process. The sample is frozen and then shipped to a lab. The dominant player in that space is IDEXX. They are the largest animal health diagnostics company in the United States. And if they're not the largest globally, they're one of a handful of the largest global players in the animal health space. And then results come back from the lab, in 3 to 5 business days generally. And that's typically how most samples are processed. About 75% of all canine blood samples are processed through reference labs. They're shipped off. About 20-25% are processed on site at the veterinary facility through a point of care technology. Heska is one of the leaders in point of care. They have a point of care device called the Element I+. And so if the results are needed very quickly, the sample can be put into a cartridge into the Element I+, and results come back in less than 30 minutes. And then we announced a licensing deal with IDEXX very recently. They have now launched as well. As I mentioned, they're predominantly reference labs, and they're the largest animal health diagnostics reference lab company in the United States, multi-billion dollar publicly traded company, and really excited to have them as our partner as well. So most of Heska's sales will be through their point of care technology, and most of IDEXX's through reference labs. And again, with IDEXX, we're expecting kind of in that low double-digit revenue stream to Volition for unit sales of our blood test. So this is very transformational for Volition. It's our first commercial product. We expect a steady ramp in terms of revenue over the next few years. It's hard to predict what the revenue growth looks like this year, as both of these companies are just in the early stages of launching, of educating veterinarians. It was funny, I was unfortunately have a very sick dog myself, but I was in the veterinary hospital 2 nights ago, and we were just talking about our dog's diagnostic history, and we had mentioned that it had a cancer tested. It actually had the Nu-Q Vet cancer screening test a couple of years ago, when it was just being sold through Texas A&M, and the doctor said, "Oh, I've heard of that. It's a fairly new test." So, and this is a smaller veterinary hospital in New England, and I was very pleased that she was already aware of this test, most likely from the IDEXX salesperson. So really excited for this launch. This is expected to generate significant revenue for us over the next many years to come, and is really transformational for the company. I'll just turn back to Nu-Q Nets, the second vertical I wanted to discuss today, and then I'll answer some questions, because I will try to leave about 5 minutes or 7 minutes for questions. So Nu-Q Nets. NETS is an acronym for neutrophil extracellular traps, and we're looking at the disease state, sepsis, thrombosis, and also COVID-19. And what happens when a person is infected with a particular bacteria or virus or pathogen? One of your body's first immune responses is for your white blood cells to migrate to the infection site, to wherever that bacteria or virus has infected the body, and to unwind chromatin material into nucleosomes. And these nucleosomes, as you can see from the diagram on the right, they act as kind of a spider web or a net, hence the acronym NETS. And they contain cytotoxic proteins, and they try to envelop the invading pathogen and neutralize it, so to try and eliminate it and stop it from spreading and progressing. Now, for reasons unknown, in certain individuals, their bodies overproduce NETs in a significant quantity. And what that means is there's a significant overproduction of cytotoxic proteins. And so this overproduction of cytotoxic proteins causes problems, right? It starts to cause damage, not just to the invading pathogen, but to your body as well. It can damage your tissue, it can damage your organs, and it can lead to thrombosis, stroke, and death. And this is the cytokine storm that we all heard about during the peak of the pandemic. So how will this test be used? As you can see here, the initial focus, as I mentioned, on sepsis and also on COVID-19. So how will this test ideally be positioned in a hospital or in the healthcare marketplace? What happens when a person is confirmed infected with COVID-19 or sepsis is they're generally monitored. So it's a little bit different for each. With COVID-19, if you're infected with COVID-19, but you're very mildly symptomatic, what happens is you're sent home to isolate, right? But for certain individuals, they get really, really sick, on day 5 or day 10, and often get rushed back to the hospital for medical treatment. And sometimes there's damage that's already been done because they're not in the hospital receiving medical resources, or there's a delay in getting access to certain medical resources. With sepsis, it's a little bit different. Most of the sepsis infections occur in the hospital. Unfortunately, it's when a patient goes in for another procedure, and unfortunately they catch a bacterial infection called sepsis. It's a huge problem. If you look at the statistics here, the market alone is $22 billion. The more granular statistics are alarming. If you can see here, at least 1.7 million adults every year are confirmed infected with sepsis. 350,000 of those die from a sepsis infection. It's a huge percentage of individuals, and sepsis is probably underdiagnosed for many reasons that we won't go into. So that 1.7 million number is likely much higher than that. But regardless, you have 350,000 Americans dying each year from an infection that they didn't have before they went into the hospital. And most of these do occur in hospital. So what happens currently, if a person is confirmed infected with sepsis, they're monitored, right? And if they have a really, really bad reaction, a few hours later or the next day or several days later, they're treated. So it's reactionary medicine. The same with COVID-19. If a person is mildly symptomatic, but then they become very, very sick, very highly symptomatic, on day 5 or day 8, for instance, then they're treated. So our test is designed to try and get ahead of the onset of those severe symptoms, because right now there's really no way to know which patients infected with sepsis or COVID-19 that are currently experiencing mild symptoms will progress to really severe symptoms. There's really no good prognostic tool available. Our test will ideally be that tool. So what we know about our technology and our test for NETs is that with very high accuracy, we can quantify the amount of NETs debris in a patient's blood sample. And we know that quantity is directly correlated to disease severity. So patients infected with sepsis or COVID that are asymptomatic had 50 to 100 nanograms per microliter of NETs debris in their blood sample. Those with moderate symptoms, 10,000 nanograms per microliter, and those with very severe symptoms, 20 to 22,000 nanograms per microliter. So there's a very clear, quantifiable process that we have. It's clearly correlated with disease severity. So ideally what will happen is if a person's infected with sepsis, for instance, in the hospital, they're experiencing mild symptoms, they would get a NETs blood test from Volition a couple times a day to monitor their NETs level. If they go from 1,000 or 100 nanograms per microliter to 15,000, but they're still not highly symptomatic or very severely sick, we know that patient's about to get very sick because their NETs levels just spiked. The body's gone into overproduction of the cytotoxic proteins. And that means the patient needs medical resources and is going to need medical resources. So they could start to be administered. Perhaps the immune system could be primed, could be boosted. They could be given certain, injectables or certain therapies or treatments, ideally to mitigate the onset of those severe symptoms. So really excited about the opportunity here in NETosis as well. It's a huge, huge opportunity because COVID is still going around, and sepsis, unfortunately, is still a very common occurrence in hospitals today. We're in clinical stage here. We are looking now at running longitudinal studies right now to see what that lag time is between the spike or the overproduction of nets and how soon a person gets sick thereafter. So if there's a nice window of opportunity, if there's a 12 or 24 or 36-hour window, then we have a very powerful prognostic test because we'll be able to get ahead of the onset of severe symptoms. Right now, we're behind it. Person is mild, then really sick from sepsis, then they're treated. And it's always better, of course, to treat ahead of the symptoms, so preventative care. So ideally, this tool will flag a number of individuals who are about to get really sick. They could be treated, reducing morbidity rates or damage to their organs and long-term sickness rates, and also reducing mortality rates. So really excited about that opportunity. And then I'll just finish up on our financial slide. Sorry for the quick skip through, but I do want to answer a couple of questions. Again, ticker VNRX. Market cap has fluctuated quite significantly the past couple of years. 16.4 million in cash at the end of Q3. But again, we have revenue opportunities coming from primarily from the Heska and IDEX sales, and again the 13 million in non-dilutive capital that we expect from Heska by the end of Q2 this year. 5 analysts cover the company, really clean cap structure, just common and stock options for management. Strong insider ownership at about 17.5%. We're covered by Maxim Group, we're covered by Benchmark, we're covered by EF Hutton, we're covered by Cantor Fitzgerald and Zacks. So thank you all very much for your time and attention today. Our website, volition.com. Hopefully all of you will go to the website to learn more about our company and sign up for our email distribution list so you can continue to follow our progress over the coming quarters and years. I'll quickly go to look at the questions that have popped into the chat box. One question: can you share revenue projections for 2023? It's a great question, and it's really hard to predict. Both Heska and IDEX are ramping right now. They're educating their sales force. Their sales force is starting to educate vets. I wouldn't expect a massive increase in revenue in 23. I think that's going to come more in 24 and 25 once the vets are fully educated, once Heska and IDEX sales forces are fully educated. But you can do the math, with 25 million canines eligible for asymptomatic screening, you have a base number there. And then if some of those canines go twice per year, as is recommended, there could be, a second opportunity for our test to be administered. I didn't talk about this, but there's also a monitoring use case, probably another 5 to 10 million tests per year. So you can kind of do the math. If you use somewhere between $5 and $12 per test that we get, somewhere in that range, times the number of tests that are sold out of the, say, 30, 35 million tests that could be administered each year, you can get to some revenue figures. In terms of the ramp, it's really hard to predict. Good question about the total addressable market. Heska, I believe, has about 20% market share in point of care in the US, and Heska has about 45% of the reference lab market. So combined, individually and combined, they're both significant players, both in point of care and reference labs, with IDEX being, just a gigantic player in the reference lab space. So they, both of them together, have a significant amount of market share. And again, you can, multiply those percentages times whatever number of tests, you think are sold. We can point you to some of our research reports and analyst reports, and they have some projections going forward. It is difficult to project, but we do expect significant revenue growth, over time. Another question about the up to $10 per test. If you kind of, I think if in our PowerPoint, I think we're using around $7.5, $7.50 per test. So it depends on whether it's point of care or versus reference lab. It depends whether it's Heska or IDEX. But if you're using it somewhere in that 5 to 12 range, you can kind of get a sense of what our revenue is per test. Another good question: if the Nu.Q test comes back positive, does it provide any indication of what and where the cancer is? Really good question. Yes and no, because breeds of canine typically get the same type of cancer. So the vets generally just need to know if it's cancer or not. Then based upon the breed and the age, they have a pretty good sense of what is afflicting the canine in terms of what cancer type and where to look. So again, really good question. I think that's all I have time for, but happy to schedule a one-on-one with anyone. My contact information is also available on Volition's website if any of you wanted to reach out by phone or email to schedule a follow-up call. But thank you all for your time and attention today in VolitionRX Ltd. VNRX